Rain pounded the darkened streets as Karen crouched in the shadows, heart pounding. The reckless decision she made earlier tonight would either free her family from the Ihoa's tyranny or destroy them. Gripping the manila envelope in her trembling hands, she steeled her nerves and hurried towards the towering, ominous gates of Evergreen Estates. Swiping her keycard, Karen slipped past the automatic barrier, her eyes darting left and right. The usual well-lit, manicured grounds were cloaked in an eerie silence, save for the muffled hum of security cameras. Her footsteps echoed ominously as she raced towards her home, praying she hadn't been followed. Bursting through her front door, Karen frantically surveyed the living room. Her husband, Tom, sat rigidly on the couch, face ashen. "They're coming," he whispered hoarsely. "The HOA president and the police. They found out about the garden." Karen's blood ran cold. For months, she poured her heart and soul into cultivating an organic vegetable garden, a simple act of defiance against the Ihoa's draconian rules. But now her carefully crafted plan to expose their corruption had been discovered. "How?" she demanded, clutching the envelope. "I was so careful." Before Tom could respond, a thunderous knock echoed through the house. Exchanging a terrified glance, they slowly opened the door to find the hulking figure of HOA President Martin Whittaker, flanked by two stone-faced police officers. "Mrs. Worthington," Whittaker growled, his beady eyes glinting with malice. "We have reports of an unauthorized garden on your property. I'm afraid that's a direct violation of our bylaws." Karen lifted her chin defiantly. "I have evidence of your corruption, Whittaker. You've been embezzling funds and rigging elections for years." Whittaker's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Evidence? I'm afraid that won't do you any good." He nodded to the officers. "Arrest her." As the police moved in, Karen thrust the envelope towards Tom. "Get this to the local news. Expose them before they—" But her words were cut off as strong hands seized her arms, wrenching them behind her back. "Karen Worthington, you're under arrest for unlawful gardening and obstruction of HOA authority," one of the officers declared. "No," Karen cried, struggling in vain. "You can't do this. I'm fighting for our community." Whittaker watched impassively as she was dragged away, his cruel smile never wavering. "Welcome to Evergreen Estates, Mrs. Worthington, where the HOA is the law." Karen's heart pounded as she was shoved into the back seat of the police car, the rain-soaked streets of her once idyllic neighborhood disappearing from view. She had to find a way to get that evidence to the media before Whittaker buried it for good. But as the car pulled away, she realized with sinking dread that her husband had not followed through. The envelope remained in his hands, his face etched with fear and uncertainty. Had she just made the biggest mistake of her life? The interrogation room was cold and sterile, the flickering fluorescent lights casting an unforgiving glare. Karen sat rigidly in the hard metal chair, her wrists throbbing from the tight handcuffs. Across the table, Whittaker leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "You know, Mrs. Worthington, I have to admire your audacity. Trying to expose my corruption with a few measly documents, it's almost quaint." Karen glared at him defiantly. "The truth will come out, Whittaker. You can't silence me forever." The HOA president chuckled darkly. "Oh, I think you'll find I can." He leaned forward, his cold eyes boring into hers. "You see, I have eyes and ears everywhere in this community, and anyone who dares to cross me—" His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "Well, let's just say they tend to have a habit of disappearing." Karen's blood ran cold at the implication. She had to get that evidence to the media, no matter what. As if reading her thoughts, Whittaker lazily pulled the manila envelope from his jacket pocket. "Looking for this, are we?" He said disapprovingly. "That's Mrs. Worthington. Did you really think I wouldn't find it?" Karen's heart sank. "What have you done to my husband?" Whittaker's smile widened. "Nothing. Yet. But if you continue to be a thorn in my side, let's just say the consequences could be severe." He tucked the envelope back into his jacket. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to plead guilty to the charges against you, and in return, I'll make sure your family remains unharmed." Karen's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of this nightmare. "And if I refuse?" Whittaker's eyes narrowed. "Then I'm afraid the next time you see your precious husband, it will be at his funeral." The words hung in the air, icy and menacing. Karen felt her resolve crumbling, the weight of her decision crushing her. How could she choose between her own freedom and her family's safety? A knock at the door interrupted the tense silence, and a young officer poked his head in. "Sir, the patrol car just reported in. They're on their way with the suspect." Whittaker rose from his chair, smoothing his tie. "Excellent. Looks like our little chat is over, Mrs. Worthington." He paused at the door, his expression darkening. "I'd think very carefully about your next move. Time is running out." As the door slammed shut, Karen buried her face in her hands, tears she'd been holding back finally spilling over. She had to find a way to get that evidence out, even if it meant risking everything. The fate of her family and the entire community depended on it. But with Whittaker's chilling threats still ringing in her ears, she knew she was playing a deadly game. One wrong move and it could all come crashing down. The quiet hum of the interrogation room was shattered by the sudden slam of the door. Karen looked up with red-rimmed eyes to see a familiar face, Detective Olivia Ramirez, and one cop in town she thought she could trust. "Mrs. Worthington," Ramirez said, her voice low and urgent. "We need to get you out of here now." Karen stared at her in disbelief. "But the charges?" "Forget the charges," Ramirez interrupted, already working on the handcuffs. "Whittaker's got the whole department in his back pocket. We don't have much time." As the cuffs fell away, Karen rubbed her wrists, a glimmer of hope stirring her chest. "Then you believe me? About the corruption?" Ramirez nodded grimly. "I suspected it for a while, but I could never prove it. Until now." She reached into her jacket, pulling out the familiar manila envelope. "Your husband gave this to me. Said you needed to get it to the media before Whittaker buried it." Karen's heart leaped. "Tom, is he all right?" "He's safe for now," Ramirez said hurriedly. "But Whittaker's got eyes everywhere. We need to move fast." She ushered Karen out of the interrogation room and down a deserted hallway, cautiously peeking around corners. As they neared the exit, a sudden shout made them both freeze. "Hey, you two! What's going on here?" Ramirez cursed under her breath, shoving the envelope into Karen's hands. "Run, Mrs. Worthington. Get this to the press. Expose Whittaker for the crook he is. I'll hold them off as long as I can." Karen hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. "But what about you?" Ramirez gave her a grim smile. "Don't worry about me. Just go." With a final nod, Karen turned and fled, her heart pounding as she pushed through the emergency exit and out into the rain-soaked night. Clutching the precious envelope to her chest, she ran, ducking through alleyways and side streets, desperate to put as much distance between herself and the police station as possible. The rain pounded her face as she rounded a corner, nearly colliding with a figure in the shadows. She let out a startled gasp, only to be met with the familiar face of her neighbor, Mrs. Finnegan. "Mrs. Worthington," the elderly woman exclaimed, gripping Karen's arm. "I saw what happened, the police, the arrest. Are you all right?" Karen nodded breathlessly. "I am fine, but I need to get this evidence to the media before Whittaker can bury it." Mrs. Finnegan's eyes widened. "The media? Then you better hurry. I heard there's a storm coming, and the power might go out soon." Karen's heart sank. If the power went out, Whittaker would have the perfect opportunity to silence her for good. "Can I use your phone?" she asked desperately. "Of course, dear. Come inside," Mrs. Finnegan said, ushering her into the cozy warmth of her home. As Karen dialed the number for the local news station, a deep rumble of thunder shook the windows. The storm was closing in and time was running out. She had to get this evidence out before Whittaker's grip on the community became unbreakable. The line clicked and a voice answered. "This is Channel 5 News. How can I help you?" Karen took a deep breath. "My name is Karen Worthington, and I have evidence of corruption within the Evergreen Estates Homeowners Association." The newsroom was a flurry of activity as Karen's call echoed through the speakers. The producer, a young woman named Emily, leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Mrs. Worthington, are you saying the Idaho president is corrupt?" she asked, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Yes," Karen replied urgently, "and I have evidence to prove it. But I don't have much time. The power could go out at any moment." Emily nodded, a steely determination in her gaze. "Okay, Mrs. Worthington, I need you to tell me everything, and I mean _everything_. We're going to get this story on the air tonight, no matter what." As Karen recounted Whittaker's embezzlement scheme and his chilling threats, Emily relayed the information to the anchor, her fingers a blur on the keyboard. The newsroom sprang into action, producers barking orders and cameramen rushing to gather their equipment. "We're going live in 5 minutes, Mrs. Worthington," Emily said, her voice taut with urgency. "Can you get to our studio in time?" Karen glanced out the window, where dark clouds were gathering ominously. "I'll try, but the storm is moving in fast. Just please get this information out there before Whittaker can stop you." "We've got your back, Mrs. Worthington," Emily assured her. "Now go and be careful." Clutching the envelope, Karen raced out into the downpour, her feet pounding the rain-slicked pavement. The wind howled, whipping her hair across her face as she darted through the shadows, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of pursuit. As she neared the news station, a sudden flash of lightning illuminated a dark figure lurking at the entrance. Karen's breath caught in her throat. It was Whittaker, his expression twisted with rage. "Mrs. Worthington," he bellowed, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "You've made a grave mistake." Karen didn't hesitate, turning on her heel and sprinting down a side street, her heart pounding in her ears. She could hear Whittaker's heavy footsteps behind her, the sound of his enraged shouts echoing through the alleys. Turning a sharp corner, Karen spotted a familiar storefront, Mrs. Finnegan's antique shop. Without a moment's hesitation, she darted inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. "Mrs. Worthington." Mrs. Finnegan's voice called out, tinged with concern. "Shah," Karen hissed, pressing her back against the door. "Whittaker's out there. I need to hide." The old woman's eyes widened and she quickly ushered Karen into the back room, the sound of Whittaker's fists pounding on the door echoing ominously. "You can't hide from me, Mrs. Worthington." Whittaker's muffled voice boomed. "I'll find you, and when I do, you and your family will pay dearly." Karen held her breath, her grip tightening on the envelope as the pounding subsided and Whittaker's footsteps faded into the distance. Mrs. Finnegan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, her eyes filled with sympathy. "Don't worry, dear," she whispered. "I'll make sure that evidence gets to the news station. You just stay here and stay safe." Karen nodded, her heart still pounding. "Thank you, Mrs. Finnegan. I don't know what I'd do without you." The old woman smiled. "We look out for each other in this community, Mrs. Worthington, and I'll be damned if I let that monster Whittaker trample all over us." As Mrs. Finnegan slipped out the back, Karen sank into a chair, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The storm raged on outside, the power flickering ominously, and she couldn't help but wonder if she had just sealed her family's fate. But deep down, she knew she had to keep fighting. For her husband, for her community, and for the truth. No matter what Whittaker had planned, she would not back down. The breaking news alert flashed across the screen, cutting through the storm's howling wind. Tom sat on the edge of the couch, his heart pounding as the anchor's voice filled the room. "We interrupt your regularly scheduled programming to bring you an urgent breaking news story. Earlier tonight, local homeowner Karen Worthington contacted our newsroom with explosive allegations of corruption within the Evergreen Estates Homeowners Association." Tom gripped the edge of the cushion, his knuckles turning white. Where was Karen? Was she safe? The anchor continued, "Mrs. Worthington claims that HOA President Martin Whittaker has been embezzling funds and rigging community elections for years. She also alleges that Whittaker threatened her and her family in an attempt to cover up his crimes." Tom's breath caught in his throat. He knew this day would come, but he never imagined it would be so dangerous. "We have obtained documents that appear to corroborate Mrs. Worthington's claims," the anchor reported. "However, just moments ago, our news crew was informed that the power in the Evergreen Estates neighborhood has gone out, leaving the community in darkness." Tom's heart sank. Whittaker had made his move. "We urge all residents to remain indoors and lock their doors until the power is restored. This is a developing story, and we will continue to update you as more information becomes available." The screen went dark, and the house was plunged into eerie silence, save for the howling of the wind. Tom sat motionless, his mind racing with a million thoughts. Where was Karen? Was she safe? And what was Whittaker planning to do? A sudden knock at the door made him jump. Cautiously, he peered through the peephole, only to be greeted by the familiar face of his neighbor, Mrs. Finnegan. Throwing the door open, he ushered her inside, his eyes wild with fear. "Mrs. Finnegan, what's happening? Where's Karen?" The old woman's eyes were filled with urgency. "Tom, you need to get out of here now. Whittaker is on the warpath, and he's not going to stop until he silences your wife for good." Tom's blood ran cold. "Where is she?" "I have to find her." Mrs. Finnegan gripped his arm. "She's safe for now, but you need to leave before Whittaker comes after you too. Take this." She pressed a set of car keys into his hand. "Go to the news station, find the producer named Emily. She'll help you get the rest of that evidence to the media." Tom stared at the keys, his mind racing. "But what about you? And Karen?" "Don't worry about us," Mrs. Finnegan said firmly. "I'll make sure Karen gets to safety. You just focus on getting that information out there. The community needs to know the truth." Tom hesitated, his heart torn between his desire to protect his wife and the urgent need to expose Whittaker's corruption. But he knew that Mrs. Finnegan was right. The media was their only hope. "All right," he said, his voice trembling. "But please keep Karen safe. I can't lose her." Mrs. Finnegan gave him a reassuring nod. "I promise, Tom. Now go before it's too late." With a deep breath, Tom turned and slipped out the door, the wind and rain whipping at his face as he raced towards the news station. The streets were eerily deserted, the only sound the howling of the storm. As he reached the news station, he could see the flickering emergency lights in the distance. Gripping the car keys tightly, he steeled himself for what lay ahead. Karen had risked everything to expose the truth, and he couldn't let her down. The news station was a hive of frantic activity, producers and cameramen scrambling to get their coverage on the air despite the blackout. Tom pushed his way through the chaos, searching for the producer named Emily. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice barely audible over the din. "I'm looking for Emily. Is she here?" A young woman with a headset looked up, her eyes widening. "You must be Tom Worthington. Emily's been expecting you." She gestured towards a small office. "She's in there, go." Tom hurried to the office, his heart pounding. As he burst through the door, he found Emily hunched over a laptop, a grim expression on her face. "Tom, thank God you're here," she said, ushering him in. "We've been trying to reach you and Karen, but the blackout has us cut off from the rest of the city." Tom gripped the car keys tightly. "I know Mrs. Finnegan sent me. She said you'd help me get the rest of the evidence to the media." Emily nodded, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "We've already aired the initial report, but Whitaker's people are trying to shut us down. We need to get the full story out there before he can bury it." She pulled a USB drive from her pocket and handed it to Tom. "This contains all the documents we received from Karen. I need you to take it to our sister station in the next town over. They can broadcast the story from there and keep it safe from Whitaker's influence." Tom's heart sank. "But what about Karen? Mrs. Finnegan said she'd keep her safe, but I can't just leave her here." Emily placed a hand on his arm, her eyes filled with sympathy. "I know it's hard, Tom, but right now the most important thing is getting that evidence out. Karen's counting on you to do this." Tom wavered, his mind torn between his loyalty to his wife and the need to expose the truth. After a moment, he steeled his resolve. "All right, I'll do it. But please, you have to promise me you'll keep trying to reach Karen." "I swear," Emily said solemnly. "Now go before Whitaker's goons realize you're here." Tom nodded, turning to leave, but a sudden commotion outside made him freeze. Cautiously peeking out the window, he saw a group of armed men in dark suits approaching the building. "Shit, they're here," Emily whispered. "Tom, you have to go now." Without hesitation, Tom raced out the back exit, the USB drive clutched tightly in his hand. The rain pounded his face as he sprinted down the dark alley, his mind consumed by worry for Karen's safety. As he reached the car, he paused, a sudden realization dawning on him. If Whitaker's men were after the evidence, then that meant Karen was in grave danger. You couldn't just abandon her, not when she needed him most. With a deep breath, Tom turned and headed back towards the news station, his resolve hardening. He would get the evidence to the other station, but first, he had to find a way to save his wife. The streets were eerily deserted, the blackout casting an ominous shadow over the entire neighborhood. Tom's eyes darted left and right, searching for any sign of Karen or her captors. Rounding a corner, he spotted a familiar figure, huddled in the shadows. Mrs. Finnegan, her face etched with worry. "Tom," she exclaimed, rushing to him. "Thank goodness you're all right, but where's the evidence?" "I have it," Tom said, "but first we need to find Karen. Whitaker's men are after her, and I can't just leave her." Mrs. Finnegan's eyes widened with fear. "Oh dear, we have to hurry then. I think I know where they've taken her." Without another word, the two of them set off into the darkness, determined to save Karen from Whitaker's clutches and to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The rain pounded relentlessly as Tom and Mrs. Finnegan hurried through the deserted streets, their footsteps echoing ominously. The blackout had cast a veil of eerie silence over the neighborhood, and the air was thick with an oppressive tension. "Where are we going?" Tom whispered, his heart pounding. "The old community center," Mrs. Finnegan replied, her voice hushed. "Whitaker's been using it as a headquarters of sorts, a place to hold meetings and make deals with the HOA members." Tom's jaw tightened. "You think that's where they're keeping Karen?" Mrs. Finnegan nodded grimly. "It's the only place that makes sense. Whitaker's got eyes and ears everywhere in this neighborhood. If he wanted to keep her hidden, that would be the perfect spot." As they neared the looming community center, Tom could feel his palms grow sweaty. The building was dark, save for a faint glow emanating from a single window on the top floor. His grip tightened on the USB drive, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. "All right, here's the plan," Mrs. Finnegan whispered, her eyes narrowed. "I'll create a distraction, draw Whitaker's men away from the building. That'll give you a chance to sneak in and find Karen." Tom's brow furrowed. "But what about you? I can't just let you put yourself in danger." Mrs. Finnegan gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about me, dear. I've been dealing with Whitaker's nonsense for years. I can handle a few of his goons." She placed a hand on his arm. "Just focus on getting Karen and that evidence to safety. The rest of the community is counting on you." Before Tom could protest, the elderly woman was off, her frail frame moving with an unexpected agility as she slipped into the shadows. Steeling his nerves, Tom crept towards the community center, his senses on high alert. The heavy wooden doors creaked ominously as he pushed them open, the dim light from the upper floor casting an eerie glow. Carefully, he made his way up the winding staircase, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. At the top, he paused, his heart pounding in his ears. The hallway was eerily silent, save for a muffled sound coming from a room at the end. Cautiously, he approached the door, pressing his ear against the wood. "I'm warning you, Whittaker," came Karen's defiant voice. "The truth is going to come out no matter what you do." Tom's breath caught in his throat, and he steeled himself, gently pushing the door open. Inside, he found Karen bound to a chair, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and determination. Across from her, Whittaker stood, his face twisted in a menacing sneer. "Oh, I don't think so, Mrs. Worthington," the HOA president sneered. "You see, I have eyes and ears everywhere. And anyone who tries to expose my activities, well, let's just say they have a habit of disappearing." Tom's blood ran cold, and he gripped the USB drive tighter, his knuckles turning white. He had to find a way to get that evidence to the media, and he had to do it now before Whittaker could silence them for good. Slowly, he began to edge his way into the room, his mind racing with 1,000 possible scenarios. But just as he was about to make his move, a sudden noise from the hallway made him freeze. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, drawing ever closer. Tom's heart raced as the footsteps drew nearer, his grip tightening on the USB drive. He glanced frantically around the room, searching for a place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. Suddenly, a familiar voice rang out from the hallway. "Freeze, Whittaker. This is the police." Tom's head snapped towards the door, and to his relief he saw Detective Ramirez standing there, her gun drawn. Beside her, several other officers were fanning out, their own weapons raised. Whittaker's face twisted in a snarl, and he whirled to face the intruders. "What is the meaning of this?" Ramirez's eyes narrowed. "We have a warrant for your arrest, Whittaker. You're going down for embezzlement, fraud, and obstruction of justice." The HOA president's eyes darted around the room, his expression a mix of panic and fury. "You can't do this. I have eyes and ears everywhere. This community is mine." "Not anymore," Ramirez said, her voice cold and unyielding. "We've been building a case against you for months, thanks to the evidence provided by the Worthingtons." She turned her gaze to Tom, her expression softening. "Are you and Karen all right?" Tom nodded, a wave of relief washing over him. "We're fine, thanks to you." Ramirez smiled and turned her attention back to Whittaker, who was now being restrained by the other officers. "It's over, Whittaker. Your reign of terror is done." As the disgraced HOA president was led away, Tom rushed to Karen's side, quickly untying her bonds. She embraced him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "Tom, you're safe," she whispered. "I was so worried." "I'm here, Karen," he murmured, holding her close. "It's over. We did it." Ramirez approached them, a small smile on her face. "Mrs. Worthington, the evidence you provided has been crucial in taking Whittaker down. The entire community owes you a debt of gratitude." Karen squeezed Tom's hand, her expression resolute. "It's not just me, Detective. Tom and our neighbors all played a part in this. We stood together against Whittaker's corruption, and we won." Ramirez nodded, her eyes sparkling with admiration. "Well, you too should be proud. This is a victory for the entire Evergreen Estates community." As the police began to secure the scene, Tom and Karen stepped out into the night, the storm finally beginning to subside. The once ominous streets were now alive with the sound of cheering and laughter as neighbors emerged from their homes to celebrate Whittaker's downfall. Karen turned to Tom, her eyes shining with pride. "I can't believe we actually did it. We took down the evil tyrant." Tom wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I never doubted you, Karen. You're the bravest, most determined person I know." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We make a pretty good team, don't we?" As they watched the community come together, rebuilding the trust and camaraderie that Whittaker had worked so hard to destroy, Karen couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. This was more than just a victory for her family. It was a triumph for the entire neighborhood, a testament to the power of unity and the unwavering pursuit of justice. And as they walked hand in hand into the uncertain future, Karen knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together with the strength and resilience that had carried them through this ordeal. For the first time in a long while, the Worthingtons felt truly at home in Evergreen Estates.